the report points out that if it were not for DOJ and their demand to ATF to do something different here, that Fast and Furious would not have happened in the first place, right?
Right, and a lot of these same Fast and Furious players, I like to call them, Bill Newell, Mark Chait, Bill McMahon, Billy Hoover, all have long histories of getting away with behavior that isn't necessarily ethical or something that ATF should be doing in terms of running their operations the way that they did. And because DOJ oversees those people within ATF, DOJ had a responsibility to kind of keep them in check, but for years and years and years decided to kind of let them get away with whatever they wanted to do. What I thought was interesting is, throughout this process, we've seen ATF pointing the finger at DOJ, DOJ pointing the finger back at ATF, which is a tactic that they're using to try and get people confused about actually what happened.
Right.
ATF said that, the report says ATF used flawed legal advice from the U.S. Attorney's Office as an excuse to allow the transfers of weapons to take place. So ATF was saying, well, DOJ was never prosecuting any of our cases, which was true.
Yeah.
But that's not an excuse, because if you knew they weren't going to prosecute your cases, shouldn't you have stopped gun walking? When you knew that they weren't going to prosecute these straw purchasers who were transferring guns, why would you allow them to transfer 2,500 weapons before you decided the DOJ wasn't going to prosecute your cases?
Yeah.
After the first one or two cases, they definitely should have stopped there. And so, it seems like, to me, based on this report, they're still doing this is ATF's fault, this is DOJ's fault, there was a communication breakdown, but, the fact is that they've all been communicating about this. DOJ had a heavy role in communicating with ATF about this, and so I think, it still comes down to them trying to place the blame on someone else, which they've been doing all along.
Absolutely. All right, so a lot of attention has been paid to, the 5 supervisors within ATF that this report focuses on. But again, we know that this is just the first of 3 reports, so there are going to be a lot of other names out there who will ultimately bear some culpability.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this report really comes down on ATF, and the other one will be about the DOJ in particular, and then I believe the third one will be more about their findings in terms of not a final because they're not done with this, but just a wrap up of what they know so far on top of the report that was issued a year ago about the program. Looking at the names here. Dennis Burke is someone, former U.S. Attorney of Arizona, Dennis Burke, who has been flying under the radar.
Right.
He was the one who was, the head of the U.S. Attorney's office in Arizona, overseeing Fast and Furious from the ground level on behalf of DOJ. What I found interesting is, and granted, there are 2,000 pieces of documentation that we have to go through here.
Okay.
The report is 200 pages long, but if you go through all of the attachments, there's a lot more to go through, so I still have to dig up a couple things. But so far, what I found the most interesting is, we're speaking about DOJ blaming ATF and vice versa. There's an email from Dennis Burke to Monty Wilkinson, who was serving as Holder's, one of his top staffers, on the day Brian Terry was killed, just hours before, at 12:28 p.m. on December 14th.
Okay.
Saying the AG's office is interested in bringing out the AG to announce the indictments in this case, meaning going in front of the public, announcing the indictments for Operation Fast and Furious. Brian Terry gets killed that night, and the story changes. Dennis Burke emails a couple days later and says, never mind, AG's not interested in coming out. Well, why? Because someone had been killed as a result of this program that they wanted the AG to announce. And if anyone understands how the Justice Department works, the AG, you don't ask the AG to come to your case. The AG decides where they're going to go.
Right.
And the AG doesn't just show up to any kind of case. They show up to cases they're aware of. Oh, sorry, now my phone's ringing. They show up to cases that they've been aware of, cases that they've been briefed on extensively, because they're not going to show up somewhere in public to a huge press audience, which is rare for attorney generals to do. They don't announce very many cases.
I can't think of Eric Holder, showing up to do a lot of these things.
Right, and so they wanted him and talked about showing up to this announcement of the indictments, which, once again, let's remember who Dennis Burke is. And I'm bringing him up because I think he played a huge role in all of this communication between all of these different agencies, because he served as Janet Napolitano's staffer when she was the U.S. Attorney Attorney General in Arizona, was her chief of staff when she was governor, was her senior Homeland Security advisor for a year before being placed in Arizona as U.S. Attorney. And at the same time, he had this long-standing relationship with her.
Yeah.
He was sitting on Eric Holder's Attorney General's advisory board. So he was in direct contact with Eric Holder about border policy and trafficking, which was one of President Obama's huge things right away. And so, this comes down hard on ATF and what they did at the local level, but in the end, it all goes into this big tree of DOJ working with ATF and communicating heavily. I mean, they wanted the Attorney General of the United States to come out and announce these indictments. It's pretty clear that they were talking about everything involved in the case.
Absolutely. I mean, well, that's the thing. You're right. If you know how the D.C. bureaucracy works, you're right. When a cabinet official goes out somewhere and there is a lot of pre-planning involved. There's a lot of staffing that okay, how are we going to do this? What are we going to talk about? What are we going to highlight? And obviously, background is done into the cases or the programs that the cabinet official is going to highlight, because they don't want to be embarrassed.
Right. Because they embarrass the administration as a result.
Which is why we saw the Attorney General apparently cancel his plans to come out there after Agent Terry's murder. So the idea that the Attorney General then would have found out about Fast and Furious contemporaneous with the media reports.
Right.
Does he not know his own schedule?
He either doesn't know his own schedule, or he wasn't actually being given advice by Dennis Burke, even though he was sitting on his Attorney General's advisory board. It's very clear that there are some emails missing there between Monty Wilkinson and Dennis Burke. Those are probably emails that the Justice Department has decided not to turn over, that haven't been published by the Oversight Committee yet.
Yeah.
But it's getting even more clear that this was a program that was briefed at the very top. And I've also heard that, going back to the bureaucracy thing, attorney generals actually don't usually go and announce cases unless they actually approve them themselves, too. And so, talking to DOJ lawyers that I've had conversations with, they say that, AGs don't just show up, and most of the time, 99% of the time, they only show up to cases that they personally signed off on. And so, speaking of signing off, Bill Newell, and we've been called crazy for ever assuming that this was a operation used to push more gun control, right?
Right.
So beforehand, we had one email from July 2010 between Mark Chait and Bill Newell, two of the guys who were in a lot of hot water as a result of this program, right? Mm-hmm. That was the email pushing for,
saying, can you give us the data here?
Can you give us the data? We're pushing for a new long gun reporting measure, right?
Right.
Well, going through these documents, I've gone through about 400, 500 of them. I found at least 3 more emails with the words pushing for long gun reporting measure in them. At least 3 more. And there's also a memo addressed directly to Attorney General Eric Holder from ATF Acting Director Kenneth Melson, asking for approval to push through this new long gun reporting measure. And so, validation of what we've been saying all along and what sources have been saying, what whistleblowers have been saying. And then, on top of that, you have, just looking at the way that they handled this program, David Voth, who is also someone who's in trouble as a result of this report, and his computer has been confiscated by the Inspector General because he's under investigation by them as well as a result of this program.
Yeah.
The email that he sent after Brian Terry was killed is pretty disgraceful. He says, quote, things will most likely get ugly. So there's no remorse. There's no, this is terrible that our program got
immediately into cover your ass. Wow.
This is annoying that we have to deal with this now and that this screwed up our case. And then going back to the gun control argument, there are specific emails from David Voth that show, make the connection. If your case involves firearms recovery, meaning not they're going out and recovering them, meaning they're picking them up from crime scenes.
Right.
Make sure you make the connection between where you find them. Make sure you document how many dead people there are and connect it back to its source. That's what these emails say. And so they were making, they were pushing for not only this long gun reporting measure in multiple emails. I haven't even gotten through all of them, not to mention we don't have the 80,000 documents that have been requested.
Exactly.
Looking back on that, it just shows that this was definitely a program that was either, designed for gun control or was definitely used as a way to push for these new long gun reporting measures, even though ATF was violating their own rules of allowing these guys to come in and buy 20, 30 AK-47s at a time.
Yeah.
And so those are kind of the key things that I picked up. I thought that, the gun dealers were definitely vindicated because they're the ones who've been accused of selling to cartels when clearly this was something that the ATF was telling them to do.
Right.
And, the connections, just because, this was, like I said, the bulk of the report is about ATF. But when you can make all these connections to the people at the top, it's very clear that I think that the second report will connect very well to the first one in terms of the communication and the actions that were taken.
It is fascinating how much new information we're getting even now with the inclusion of these 2,000 documents. And again, I know for a reporter, you want to go through it as quickly as possible, but you don't want to miss anything. And
right.
We're going to be pouring over this stuff for days.
Oh yeah, if not weeks. I mean, if this is just one report with 2,000 documents. And so, the Congress, it's our duty as reporters to not just take the report as it is, but actually pour through the documents ourselves. And so that's something that I'm going to be doing, and I'm sure that you'll be doing at least to a certain extent. And so,
Now, what about the Justice Department's response, which was basically
right.
partisan hackery?
Right. Even though this was mostly about ATF, right?
Right.
Right. They, of course, came out and gave us the line that they've always given us, which was, this is false, this is a political attack, and it's all about debunked conspiracy theories. And so with that, that's what the Justice Department has responded with.
All right. Any idea when the second report is going to be released?
I'm not sure. I don't know if it'll be released in August because they're out of session. I think that would be strange for them to release it in the month of August, considering Congressman Issa will be back home in California, I assume, not in Washington, D.C., available for comment on news programs or anything else. So I'm thinking probably September and then maybe October, since the Justice Department has decided that instead of making this an issue that went away a year ago, we're going to make this right in the middle of the election, which is very convenient for everyone.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's been a lot of talk that this third report detailing the obstruction within DOJ is going to be accompanied by the filing of this lawsuit seeking to compel the release of the subpoena documents. I mean, that could come in October. That could come just a few weeks before Election Day.
Well, and two, of course, as we've heard all along, the Justice Department said, just wait for our Inspector General's report and you'll see. Right. And, okay, we can talk about that, but let's remember the Inspector General, before the Inspector General was changed out in May, for a year since the investigation was going on, the Inspector General was Cynthia Schneider, who worked as Eric Holder's staffer when he was the U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C. And so, of course, the Justice Department is saying, oh, just wait for our Inspector General report. We're totally going to be clean there. And it's like, well, yeah, because the person working on it is good friends with Eric Holder and worked for him. And so, and even though they switched it over, the new Inspector General either has to start over, which they're probably not going to do. Right. But if they do start over, then that buys them more time. And it gives them more of an excuse to say, wait for the Inspector General's report before jumping to any conclusions. So in the end, it's going to be really interesting to compare this, everything else they release, and then the Inspector General's report to everything that's happened. And we'll see where the chips fall on that. But I would say that, a lot of the evidence that we've had so far and the conclusions we've drawn at this point are correct, and especially with, the pushing of gun control and more long gun reporting measures through multiple emails to multiple different people at multiple different times is very interesting.
Absolutely. So, well, Katie, thank you again for coming in studio tonight.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Look forward to doing this again soon.
Yes, we'll have to with so many pages of stuff.
No kidding. If you find anything else noteworthy,
I'll let you know.
Let us know.
Yes,
we'll have you back
I'll send
on.
it over.
All right.